Hey, thanks so much for joining us today for another day of daily online devotionals. My name is Patrick Ramos. I'm going to jump in today. We are still in the story of Joseph. And so in Genesis chapter 41, verses 37 through 40, it says this: Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, "Can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours." And so just real quick before we dive into today's section, I just want to recap Joseph's story briefly. And so Joseph was the son of Israel. He was one of the 12 sons of Israel, and he has a dream about him and his brothers in the field, and they're gathering the harvest, and his grain pile is much larger than his brother's grain pile. And he tells his brothers, because he doesn't fully understand the meaning, and they get upset with him. They get upset because they think that means that he is superior to them. He believes that his father favored him. And so they get upset, they get angry, and they actually sell him into slavery. They sell him as a slave. He ends up in Egypt. He ends up as a slave in Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife accuses him of coming on to her, and he ends up in prison. He's in prison, and these two guys end up showing up from Pharaoh's court, the cupbearer, and we see what happens with him. He interprets the dreams for these men of Pharaoh's court. And the cupbearer actually promises Joseph, he says, "You interpreted my dream the right way. I'm going to tell Pharaoh about you." And yet he forgets about Joseph for 2 years. Joseph is stuck in prison, and he's finally called out because the cupbearer finally remembers the promise that he made to Joseph. And so Joseph shows up in Pharaoh's court. He interprets Pharaoh's dream about there being 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh understands that Joseph interpreted this correctly, and he says to him, "Can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God?" He appoints him to his high court. No one else in all of the land of Egypt except for Pharaoh himself now has authority over Joseph. Joseph has authority over everything. You see, it took him a long time, and we're actually not even to the conclusion of this story where his brothers show up and the promise of that dream that God had given him all of those years before this actually comes to fulfillment. But talking about dreams, I was actually thinking about this. Asher came up to me literally last night. Asher's my oldest son. He's 6. He just finished he just finished kindergarten. And so he came up to me and he says, "Daddy, I remember the first dream I ever had." And I just started laughing. I'm like, "What are you talking about?" I don't know about you. I don't remember any of my dreams. I very rarely remember any dreams unless they were given to me by God. And so Asher starts telling me this story about sharks and, coming up to get him while he's on the beach, and just this crazy story that a 6-year-old could come up with. And it reminded me actually about the story of Joseph. So many times when we have a dream, when we have a promise from God, for Asher, it created a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety within him. He still remembers it all of these years later from when he had that years ago. I don't think it was his first dream ever, but it stuck with him. The dream that Joseph had of him standing in the field with his brothers surrounding him, bowing down to him, I promise you that he remembered that dream because it was given to him by God. It didn't cause him fear. It created pride within him. It created knowing that God had called and chosen him. I think sometimes we forget how much our God has planned for our life. Personally, I remember a dream that God gave me literally in 2018. I was fasting. Sarah and I were praying. We were walking through a difficult situation as it relates to childbearing. And I'll never forget, God gave me a dream about holding a little girl with blonde hair. And it was 3 years later that dream finally came to fruition. Through a lot of heartache, through a lot of struggle, through a lot of chaos in our life, God finally gave me that little blonde-headed girl. And now every time I look at her, and every time she smiles at me, and every time she laughs and she giggles, she's 2 now, I just think about how faithful my God is. I think about how faithful he is in my life. I think about how faithful he has been in my family's life. I think about how faithful he has been to his church. And I'm just so thankful for what he has done for me and what he is going to continue to do for his people who love and serve him. You see, God gave Joseph a promise of what he was going to do. And I promise you that Joseph didn't always think that that promise was going to come to fruition. I know in my own life, I didn't always think that that promise was going to come to fruition. But God knows his own timing. God knows when he wants to do what he wants to do and when he wants to do it. We have to be trusting that he is going to do what he said he's going to do. If he's promised you health, still believe for health. If he has promised you a breakthrough in your finances, believe that he is the God who owns a cattle on 1,000 hilltops and will provide financially for you and for your family. If you're believing for that child like my wife and I were, be praying and believing for breakthrough in fertility. We went through the foster care system. We have a son adopted through foster care. We have another foster care child in our home right now. We have a little girl through private adoption. We tried to knock on every door waiting for God to answer. Don't stop knocking. That's my encouragement to you today. When God promises you something, don't stop knocking. Don't stop believing. Don't stop pressing into his presence, waiting on that promise to be fulfilled. Hey, thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to be praying that over you today, praying that over the church, that God's promises in your life would come to fulfillment in his timing. You have a blessed rest of your day.